The world of fashion is built on spectacle, on light, applause, and beauty so carefully crafted that it feels untouchable. But sometimes, beneath that glittering facade, lies a story that is darker, sharper, and far more haunting than the image on the runway. This is the story of Daul Kim, a name whispered in reverence, remembered in fragments, and forever bound to one of fashion's most chilling mysteries. She arrived like a spark. From Seoul to Paris, her face seemed to defy time itself. Porcelain skin, angular features, and eyes that looked less like windows than warnings. By the time she was 20, she had walked for Chanel, Dior, and McQueen, her presence so commanding that even in a sea of models, she could not be ignored. The world saw her as a rising star, an ethereal villain who embodied the bold new edge of high fashion. But here's the question that lingers. What do we truly see when the lights go out? Because Daul, unlike so many of her peers, left behind traces of herself, not on glossy magazine pages, but in the cryptic words of her personal blog. There, she spoke of exhaustion, of loneliness, of a sense of alienation that no applause could erase. "I feel like a stranger everywhere," she once confessed. They were words that, at the time, seemed like fleeting musings. In hindsight, they sound like echoes, messages sent from someone standing too close to the edge. The contrast was unsettling. On stage, Daul embodied power, poise, and the kind of beauty that made audiences gasp. Offstage, her words painted a different portrait, fragile, weary, desperate for connection. These contradictions collided in 2009 when, at only 20 years old, she was found lifeless in her Paris apartment. The news sent shockwaves through the fashion world, not only because of her youth, but because of how suddenly and how mysteriously she was gone. Her death left behind more questions than answers. Friends remembered speaking to her only hours before, hearing nothing unusual in her voice. Industry insiders fell into an eerie silence, as though acknowledging her story might reveal something they would rather keep hidden. Fans scoured her writings and artwork, searching for meaning in her fragmented words, her distorted sketches, her haunting self-portraits. What they found was not clarity, but deeper unease. Why did such a luminous star fade so suddenly? Was it the unbearable pressure of an industry that demands perfection at any cost? Was it the isolation of being celebrated yet never truly seen? Or was it something more personal, more hidden that no one outside her private world could ever fully understand? More than a decade has passed, and still the silence endures. Fashion houses that once dressed her in silk and sequins rarely mention her name, but to those who followed her story, Daul Kim is not forgotten. She lingers in memory like perfume in an empty room, faint but impossible to erase. She is remembered as both muse and enigma, a girl who conquered runways and yet seemed perpetually out of place, a reminder of how fragile brilliance can be. This is not simply a story about a model. It is about the collision of beauty and despair, of triumph and fracture. It is about the whispers left behind in words and images that refuse to settle into silence. And it is about us, about the way we consume beauty without ever asking what it costs the person who wears it. So tonight, as we revisit her journey, we will not only see Daul Kim as the industry framed her, we will step behind the curtain into the shadows she left behind, and we will ask, together, did the world celebrate her brilliance too brightly, only to miss the darkness that was waiting all along? Seoul in the 1990s was a city in transition, modern towers rising above narrow alleys, tradition colliding with the new face of globalization. In that world, a girl named Daul Kim was growing up, watching, sketching, and dreaming. She was not the kind of child people immediately imagined as a future star of the catwalk. Instead, she was an artist in miniature, quiet, restless, filling sketchbooks with distorted faces and empty eyes, long before those themes would return in her later paintings. From an early age, Daul seemed caught between worlds. At school, she was described as different, too thoughtful, too rebellious, too unwilling to bend herself into what others expected. While many of her peers embraced convention, she was drawn to the unusual, to music that unsettled, to films that lingered long after the credits ended. Even in childhood, she seemed to live with one foot in light and the other in shadow. Her height, her angular beauty, and her unflinching gaze soon attracted the attention of modeling scouts in Seoul. Yet even here, her path was unusual. South Korea's modeling scene of the mid-2000s preferred a softer image, delicate and polished. Daul was none of those things. She was sharp, intense, almost confrontational in her presence. She didn't just wear clothes, she transformed them into statements. What could have been a barrier became her weapon. Agencies realized she had something rare, a look that unsettled, that demanded attention. By 2007, she was walking the runways of Seoul, already standing out from the crowd. But it was her leap into the international scene that changed everything. When she arrived in Europe, she was stepping into an industry that still treated Asian models as occasional novelties rather than equals. Yet, the moment Daul appeared under the lights of Paris, the rules shifted. Her stride was deliberate, her gaze unyielding. She didn't smile to please. She dared the audience to look deeper. Designers noticed immediately. Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel, John Galliano at Dior, Alexander McQueen, these were not names that handed opportunities lightly. Yet, within 2 seasons, Daul was part of their shows. Her image appeared in Vogue Italia, ID, and Dazed and Confused. She was described as the Korean Kate Moss, but the comparison, while flattering, missed her essence. Moss embodied detached cool. Daul radiated something stranger, darker, more enigmatic. She was not an echo. She was her own storm. At home, the reaction was complex. On one hand, South Korea celebrated her as a national success, a symbol that its culture could stand shoulder to shoulder with Paris and Milan. On the other, her unapologetic persona, her gothic edge, and her cryptic interviews baffled those who expected sweetness and conformity. She wasn't interested in playing the role of a perfect ambassador. She was simply herself, brilliant, uncompromising, and increasingly untouchable. And yet, even in triumph, Daul revealed glimpses of unease. In interviews, when asked about her meteoric rise, she often responded with answers that sounded less like celebration and more like riddles. She once admitted, "I feel like a stranger everywhere." To some, it was the eccentric musing of a young star. To others, it was a crack in the armor, a sign of the alienation that fame was already deepening. Her ascent was meteoric, her presence unforgettable, but woven through her rise was an unmistakable tension. Every magazine cover, every runway, every editorial added to her aura and to the weight pressing down upon her. To the world, she was proof that an Asian model could not only compete, but dominate. To herself, she was a girl far from home, caught between applause and isolation. By 2009, Daul Kim had become one of fashion's most in-demand names. But success, in her case, was not freedom. It was a cage lined with glitter, one that magnified both her triumphs and her doubts. And while the world marveled at her brilliance, few realized that the shadows were already gathering, preparing to test how much one young woman could carry. By 2008, the name Daul Kim was no longer whispered in small Seoul circles. It was spoken aloud on the world's grandest stages. In Paris, Milan, and New York, she became the girl everyone wanted to see, the face that unsettled and enchanted in equal measure. She was 20 years old, and already the runway belonged to her. When she appeared in Chanel's show, her walk was measured, her gaze unwavering, as though she were daring the audience to look past the fabric and into the story she carried. At Dior, she became the embodiment of couture elegance, yet with an edge that made her impossible to confuse with anyone else. And with Alexander McQueen, her presence seemed inevitable, dark, theatrical, almost ghostly. The fashion world prided itself on being avant-garde, and Daul was its perfect mirror. Magazines raced to capture her. Vogue Italia gave her spreads that emphasized her intensity. ID styled her as a rebel queen. Dazed and Confused leaned into her otherworldliness. Each photograph seemed to tell a new version of the same truth. Daul was not just a model, she was a phenomenon. She had the rare ability to make clothes secondary, to shift the attention back to herself, to the aura she radiated. Photographers spoke of her eyes as if they were weapons, sharp enough to pierce, haunting enough to linger. What made her stand apart was that she refused to be a blank canvas. Many models of her generation were expected to disappear into the garments, to mute themselves in service of the design. Daul resisted that. She infused every pose, every step, with something of herself. It was as if she carried her own script, her own silent narrative into each performance. Audiences didn't just watch her, they remembered her. And that, in the fleeting world of fashion, was the rarest gift of all. Her success also carried symbolism. To many in Asia, her rise was a declaration. An Asian model could not only join the Western elite, but dominate it. She shattered the image of delicate, quiet beauty that had long been projected onto East Asian women in fashion. Instead, she was fierce, edgy, unapologetic. She became proof that the industry's gatekeepers could no longer ignore the demand for something different, something bolder. And yet, behind the glamour, subtle cracks were already beginning to show. In interviews, she was witty and playful, but her words often strayed into something more cryptic. "I feel like I'm always in between," she once remarked. To the media, it sounded like philosophy. To those who listened closely, it was a quiet alarm. Her blog posts, scattered with fragments of longing and disconnection, hinted at a girl who could command the runway, but still struggled to find a place in the world beyond it. Colleagues described her as magnetic, yet distant. She could be the life of an after-party, glowing under the strobe lights, and then, in the very next moment, retreat into silence, as though she were no longer in the room. To some, it made her enigmatic. To others, it made her untouchable. In truth, it was both. Still, in these years, the narrative seemed golden. The fashion world hailed her as its new muse. South Korea embraced her as a national trailblazer. International critics named her one of the most promising models of her generation. She was not simply walking in shows, she was making statements, shifting the aesthetic of the late 2000s towards something sharper, more dangerous, more alive. But brilliance often casts shadows. The brighter her star burned, the longer those shadows grew. For every editorial that cemented her place, there were words she left in private that told another story. As 2009 unfolded, Daul Kim was at the height of her career. And yet, behind the lights, the shadows were already waiting, gathering in silence, preparing to reveal that even the highest peaks can be the most precarious places of all. On the runway, Daul Kim was untouchable. She carried couture like armor, each step a declaration of strength, each stare a challenge no one could ignore. But when the stage lights dimmed, another Daul emerged, one who left behind pieces of herself in places far removed from the glamour, in blog entries, in sketches, in scattered words that revealed the fractures no camera could capture. Her personal blog became the first window into that hidden world. Written in English and Korean, her posts veered between wit and despair, between playful observations and confessions that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "I feel like a stranger everywhere," she admitted, a sentence that landed like a warning, cloaked as philosophy. Elsewhere, she wrote, "I am so tired of being strong," a line that hinted not at physical exhaustion, but at the endless effort of holding together an image the world demanded. Fans who stumbled across these entries saw them as eccentric musings, the sort of late-night reflections anyone might post. But in retrospect, they read differently, like fragments of a diary written from the edge. Each post was a paradox, the voice of a girl celebrated across the world, yet speaking as though she were invisible within it. Her artwork echoed the same themes. Between flights and fittings, she painted faces distorted, eyes hollow, figures bent in solitude. These pieces, rarely shown publicly during her life, now feel like self-portraits of the isolation she carried. Where the runway demanded perfection, her canvases allowed imperfection to bleed out. They revealed not the polished muse, but the restless artist beneath. The pressures of her position only deepened the fractures. As one of the few Asian models consistently booked by European houses, she bore the weight of representation. Fashion praised her difference, but that praise came with a reminder. She was celebrated for being other, not for belonging. On stage, she was the exotic muse. Off stage, she was the outsider. This duality, exalted and excluded, shaped the very loneliness she confessed online. There were also the mysteries. After her passing, followers noticed that certain blog entries disappeared, as though erased by unseen hands. Some speculated that her family removed them to protect her memory. Others whispered that agencies sought to sanitize the narrative. Whatever the reason, the absence of those words only fueled the sense of something being hidden, something we were never meant to know. Colleagues who worked alongside her recalled the contradictions. She could light up a room with her wit, her sarcasm sharp enough to make even jaded editors laugh. Yet at other times, she seemed to retreat into silence, her gaze distant, her presence heavy with something unspoken. To some, it made her mysterious, a living enigma. To others, it was a quiet signal of battles waged beneath the surface. The dissonance was impossible to ignore. In one world, she was immortalized in glossy editorials, her image flawless and eternal. In another, she was writing words that trembled with fragility, painting figures that seemed to cry out for release. These cracks did not destroy her image, they deepened it, added layers that made her all the more compelling. But they also foreshadowed a truth the industry was unwilling to face, that beneath the spectacle of fashion was a young woman carrying far more than the weight of designer gowns. By 2009, the tension between Daul the model and Daul the human had grown stark. To the public eye, she was ascending higher than ever. To those who read her words, she was unraveling, one cryptic entry at a time. And as the applause grew louder, the silence behind it became deafening, hinting that the stage she had conquered was also the stage that was consuming her. Paris, November 2009. The city of lights was alive with its usual rhythm. Cafes buzzing, fashion studios preparing for the next season, the streets pulsing with late autumn chill. For Daul Kim, it should have been another chapter in her meteoric rise. She was 20 years old, booked for shows, her face on the covers of magazines, her presence increasingly in demand. On the surface, everything pointed to triumph, and yet within hours, the narrative collapsed into silence. News spread quickly. Daul had been found lifeless in her Paris apartment. She was gone, suddenly, inexplicably. The shock rippled across the industry. How could someone so young, so radiant, vanish just as her brilliance reached its height? The confusion was sharpened by a contradiction. Friends who had spoken with her only hours earlier recalled conversations that were unremarkable, even playful. She had laughed, exchanged plans, sounded like herself. Nothing suggested a storm was imminent. This made the discovery all the more chilling. How could the same voice that spoke so casually one moment disappear the next? Speculation rushed to fill the void. Some whispered of heartbreak, suggesting she may have carried private wounds that few knew of. Others pointed to professional pressures, the endless flights, the weight of representing not only herself, but an entire generation of Asian models breaking into the Western scene. There were rumors of isolation in a foreign city, of being celebrated on stage yet profoundly alone once the lights dimmed. None of these stories were ever confirmed, but together they built a narrative of a young woman bearing a burden too heavy for one so young. Her writings and artwork, revisited after her death, seemed like premonitions. Blog entries spoke of exhaustion, of being tired of always appearing strong, of feeling like a stranger even in rooms filled with applause. Paintings revealed distorted faces and hollow eyes, as though her art had long been telling the truth her image could not. To admirers, these fragments became chilling evidence that her ending had been foreshadowed all along. And yet perhaps the most unsettling part of Daul's death was not the rumors, but the silence that followed. The fashion houses that had so eagerly claimed her as their muse, Chanel, Dior, McQueen, offered little more than perfunctory condolences, if they spoke at all. There was no major tribute, no industry-wide reflection. It was as if the world that had celebrated her brilliance chose to turn away the moment her story threatened to reveal its shadows. For fans, the silence was unbearable. They scoured her blog, searching for meaning in every line. They posted tributes online, calling her a legend gone too soon. They asked questions no one could answer. Had the industry ignored her warnings? Could someone have intervened? Why was there no louder outcry? The more the institutions retreated into quiet, the louder the whispers became. Her passing was not just a tragedy, it was a rupture, exposing the fragility hidden behind fashion's polished facade. It forced a reckoning, however brief, about the human costs of an industry that consumes youth and beauty at a relentless pace. Yet even as those conversations emerged, they faded quickly, overshadowed by the next season, the next face, the next spectacle. For those who truly remember Daul, her death remains a mystery, a silence that resists explanation. It is the unanswered phone call, the blog entry cut short, the painting left unfinished. It is the reminder that behind every flawless editorial lies a human being whose struggles may never fit neatly into the frame. And so we are left with questions that linger more than a decade later. Did the industry celebrate her brilliance while failing to recognize her pain? Did the applause drown out her voice until it was too late? Or is the truth of what happened to Daul Kim something we will never fully know? The shock of Daul Kim's passing did not fade quickly. For those who had followed her meteoric rise, her sudden absence felt like a fracture in the fabric of fashion itself. She had been there, on covers, on runways, on the lips of designers, and then she was gone, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any applause she had ever received. In the immediate aftermath, the industry's response was striking in its restraint. There were no sweeping tributes from the houses that had draped her in couture, no grand statements from the designers who once called her their muse. Instead, there was a quiet retreat, as though acknowledging her too loudly might force the industry to confront its own shadows. That silence spoke volumes. To admirers, it felt less like respect and more like erasure, a refusal to engage with the uncomfortable truth of what her story revealed. But outside the guarded walls of fashion, her name refused to disappear. Fans revisited her blog, scrolling through entries that now felt like confessions in plain sight. Her words, "I feel like a stranger everywhere," and "I'm so tired of being strong," were shared and reshared, not as curiosities, but as warnings that had gone unheard. Her paintings, too, gained new meaning. Distorted figures, hollow eyes, lonely silhouettes, art once overlooked now seemed like haunting windows into her private world. Together, her words and images formed a legacy not of glossy perfection, but of raw humanity. Her story also shifted the conversation about representation. In life, Daul had been one of the few Asian models to consistently command Western runways, breaking barriers with every step. In death, she became a symbol of both triumph and cost.
She proved that an Asian face could be central, not peripheral to high fashion. But she also embodied the loneliness of being different, celebrated for her uniqueness, yet excluded from belonging. In this way, her legacy was double-edged. She inspired a new generation of Asian models to step forward even as she exposed the pressures they would inherit. For young models who came after, Daul was more than a name in an archive. She was a warning. Her story became a whispered reminder that behind the glamour lurked an unforgiving demand for resilience, often without support. Some cited her as inspiration for daring to be unapologetically herself, others as a reason to tread carefully in an industry that could exalt one moment and abandon the next. Over time, her narrative has taken on a mythic quality. Writers compared her to James Dean in cinema, or Gia Karanji in fashion, icons who burned brightly, vanished young, and left behind a legend larger than life. But unlike those figures, Daul's voice remains preserved in her own words. Her blog, her interviews, her art, all of it continues to speak long after she no longer could. That directness makes her legacy unique. We do not only see her through the lens of others, we hear her from herself. In South Korea, her name has resurfaced in documentaries and retrospectives, where she is remembered not only as a fashion pioneer, but as a complex artist whose life defied easy categorization. Internationally, her influence lingers in every runway where Asian models no longer appear as exceptions, but as equals. Though she did not live to see it, the doors she helped open remain part of her inheritance to the next generation. And yet, perhaps the most enduring part of Daul's legacy is the discomfort it leaves behind. She was luminous, but she was also lonely. She was celebrated, but she was also silenced. Her story forces us to confront an industry and a culture that often values beauty more than the person behind it. That confrontation is her gift and her burden to us. Even now, Daul Kim remains unforgettable, not because she was perfect, but because she was real, too real for an industry built on illusions. And in that reality, she carved out a legacy that still whispers today, urging us not to look away from the shadows that linger behind the light.
The story of Daul Kim does not resolve neatly. It cannot be tied with a ribbon, placed in the archives of fashion, and left behind. Her life resists conclusion because it was lived in contradiction, radiant yet restless, celebrated yet solitary, remembered yet unanswered. That tension is what keeps her memory alive, long after the season in which she vanished has passed. From the outside, hers was a narrative of triumph, a girl from Seoul who conquered Paris, a face that turned heads at Chanel, Dior, and McQueen, a muse who redefined what Asian representation could look like on the global stage. She embodied everything fashion claimed to desire: originality, presence, and the ability to linger in memory. In this sense, she was a dream realized. And yet, dreams can become cages. Beneath the applause lay exhaustion. Beneath the covers of magazines lay words scrawled in a blog that spoke of loneliness, fatigue, and the alienation of being forever different. She was a pioneer, but pioneers often walk alone. The very qualities that made her iconic, her edge, her defiance, her refusal to soften, were also the qualities that isolated her. To the world, she was brilliance incarnate. To herself, she was a stranger, wandering through rooms filled with voices that did not hear her. Her passing at 20 froze her in time, turning her into something larger than life, and yet achingly incomplete. She did not live long enough to outgrow the contradictions, to rewrite her story, to prove that the darkness was only one chapter. Instead, we are left with fragments, a blog, a handful of paintings, and photographs that now feel less like fashion spreads and more like clues. And this is where the unease remains. Why did the industry, so quick to claim her genius, retreat into silence after her death? Why were the tributes so muted, the reflections so brief? Was it discomfort, guilt, or simply the relentless machinery of fashion, already moving on to the next face, the next season, the next illusion?
These unanswered questions are part of her legacy. They force us to confront not only her story, but the structures that shaped it. More than a decade later, Daul Kim endures not only as a model, but as a symbol. She is invoked when conversations arise about mental health and fashion, about the pressures faced by young women thrust into global spotlight, about the isolation that comes with being other. But beyond the symbolism, she remains a person, a young woman with a voice, an artist with sketches, a writer with words that still resonate. To reduce her to an icon alone would be another erasure, another silencing. Her story is a reminder that beauty and brilliance often come at a cost we cannot see. It asks us to look beyond the photographs and the spectacle, to acknowledge the humanity that lingers behind the mask. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Did the world celebrate her too brightly, only to overlook the shadows that were already forming? Did the industry fail to listen to the very warnings she left behind in her own words? And most haunting of all, would her story have been different if someone, anyone, had truly seen her?